Hey everyone, it's Taylor Sparks, and I have an exciting talk today at the beginning of a new semester in this brave new world of generative AI in higher ed. I say, don't fear the Reaper. What do I mean? Let's dive into it. Well, you can't help but see the headlines. We've seen a ton of them, and it is undeniable that generative AI has forever changed higher ed. Take a look at this. You've got a student who is taking an ethics class, and in the ethics class, they use ChatGPT to cheat. Oh, or about this one. The college essay is dead and nobody's prepared for how AI is going to transform higher ed. Two professors say they caught students cheating on essays with ChatGPT, explain why AI plagiarism is actually hard to prove. How about this one? Somebody using a ChatGPT detector, caught a student who didn't do anything wrong. So you have these tons and tons and more, like so many more examples. So a brave new world. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean? Well, it reminds me of the song by Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper. You know the song, the Romeo and Juliet, right? This song is about the inevitability of death. Death is coming for all of us, and we might as well just live life, because whether it comes sooner or later, it's coming, and we can't change that. So just live and enjoy life. So I feel kind of the same thing. Like the genie is out of the bottle. When it comes to generative AI, it's here. And it's not going away. So we should just embrace it, okay? So what do I mean by embrace it? I think it's inevitable, but I also think it's valuable. In today's video, I want to show you how I think it's valuable in three key ways. First, I'm going to show you how it just has completely changed the game with coding, then with writing, technical writing, and finally with ideation. Okay, let's dive into it. So coding, I have taught Python before, right? So I know what it's like. I know that for us, if you teach it on a semester system, you got 15 weeks, 3 hours a week, you can basically just cover syntax and they can maybe just start doing some things. Like here's my class when I teach, it's on GitHub. You can see it's basic stuff, right? Data types, operators, logic, functions, loops, and then you get a little bit into a little more advanced stuff, but not much. You basically spend most of the time teach them how to do syntax, the grammar of coding. Here you use a colon as opposed to a bracket, or a square bracket instead of a curly bracket, like that sort of things. At the very end of the semester, if it goes well, some of the best students can tackle a problem like this. Like here's a final exam problem for my coding class a couple years ago, where I gave them a nuclear fuel rod and it's coated with different things, and then there's the coolant layer. And I wanted them to solve the PDE basically for the thermal transport, so that you can actually plot the temperature going through the different layers, right? It might look something like this. The fuel is hot, the coolant's cool, and what does the temperature profile look like in between? Especially if you input different materials with different materials properties and thickness. So the actual engineering part of this wasn't that complicated. You plug it into an equation in a couple spots, the relevant parameters. But the coding part was challenging because you could send it sort of a dictionary that contained all these material parameters, and then it had to solve it, for anything that you sent it. That was challenging for students. Some of the best students in the class could maybe sort this out. And that's after 15 weeks of grilling and training them. Well, now we have generative AI tools, especially that work well with code, that can solve this problem basically immediately, completely changing the game, right? So let's show you some examples, right? Generative AI has made it almost entirely possible to bypass learning a syntax. Right? In fact, you can take bad code and tell it to make the syntax better. Like here's one from that exact class, right? They were reading in these different JSON configurations of materials parameters, and they were doing it one at a time, trying to pull out information, doing it in this clunky for loop. So all I said was make the code less janky, and it did. It's like, it realized right away, like, oh, I can do list comprehension, which is faster and more efficient, which allows for parallelization, which is it's better. It's a better coding practice. And so it's able to do that even for this code that it had never seen before, realize that there's an opportunity to do it more efficiently. That sort of stuff happens all the time. You can do the same thing. You can send it code and say, none of this is commented, provide a well-commented description of what's going on. And it does a great job of doing that. I do that with papers all the time. As an editor, I actually suggest a lot of the authors that submit, I tell them that we are looking for well-commented, documented code. They can just run it right through something like this and have it generate the code, comments for the code, and then just double check it that it got it right. It's so efficient, so good. If you see my previous video, then you saw how I used ChatGPT to actually do matplotlib. I'll just briefly walk through it. We asked it to generate some grain size versus strength data. Now it got it wrong. The strength should not be getting higher as you go to bigger grains. It should be going the other way around. So I said, no. It should be following Hall-Petch. And it did, you saw the equation in the code, it actually was, but there was so much noise in the data, which it was intentionally adding, which bravo, way to add noise to the data. But you couldn't see the trend. So I told it to reduce the noise by a factor of 100. And so you can see it actually come down. Now you can see the trend is actually working like it ought to. Then I said to make the plot square, and it fails at first. Interestingly, you can just be like, that didn't work. Try it a different way. It tries a different way and it gets it to work. So now I've got this nice square plot. Awesome. And then you can keep on changing things here. We told it to add tick marks. If you want to see all this score detail, jump over to my other video. I'm just going to go through these. The point is that a grad student who knew nothing about coding but wanted to make nice figures in Matplotlib, in the past, I had to teach them. And it was a pain. And there's a learning curve. And now you can basically just have it do it and then just tweak it. With minimal knowledge, you can be up and running really, really fast. So I think that many examples, you can see that coding has just changed the game. It is fantastic. If you want a student, like in the past, I had to hire computer science students, or rather I prioritized students with strong coding background like computer scientists, because I was like, I would rather teach them the narrow part of material science that their PhD is going to focus on and have them have the coding background. But maybe that's not the case anymore. Maybe I can just take students who have a strong, broad material science background and have them learn the narrow bit of coding necessary because these tools are so much easier. You can hop over to ChatGPT, for example. Let's hop over right now. Build me a neural network with LSTM and attention layers to deal with sequential materials processing data, such as the furnace temperature as a function of grain size. Okay, and you'll see that in real time, it's able to interpret that, know what I'm looking for, and here it's using TensorFlow, but you could have told it to use a different one if you wanted. It tells you what it's doing to get the data, normalize it, actually build the model. You can see the LSTM block, you can see the attention block, like, holy cow. It's just never been easier to do this. Now, it's dangerously easy because you need to understand what's going on. There still needs to be some syntax knowledge so that you can look through this. And if you wanted to change things or make sure that the dimensionality fits your data and all those things, yeah, you do have to do that. But boy, it's pretty good. Actually, it already does that automatically for you. How great is that? Very cool. Very cool example of just how I think coding is transformed. Think about it. If you're teaching a Python class, you no longer have to wait 15 weeks and give them a final project, which you hope will give them the skills to then carry that forward into all their classes. You can take a student with no coding background, teach them how to at least copy and paste code from some sort of generative AI into whatever your Python development environment that you prefer is. And you can be running it and building scripts to do actual challenges immediately. In fact, you could teach them the syntax in the context of that. Have them build the code that, whatever, does some task. And then when it doesn't work, teach them how to do unit testing. Teach them how to do debugging. Teach them how to sort of figure out what's going wrong in the code. It completely transforms the way that you could teach in what I think is a really positive and exciting way. So that's the first bit. I think coding has changed. Now, there's other ways that generative AI can completely expand the capabilities of our students, and obviously writing is going to be part of that. When I think back on the first paper that I wrote as a grad student, you can see it over here. It's this paper in the American Ceramic Society, great journal, great society. It's called Anisotropic Thermal Diffusivity and Conductivity of this lanthanum-doped strontium niobate. So this is the first one I ever wrote. And, I think a lot of faculty kind of see it this way. They think, get some new student, some fresh-faced, incoming grad student. Here's me on my first day of class in grad school at UCSB. Look at that, baby. Got my thermodynamics, my thermal physics. I'm ready to solve problems. So you take that, this potential of a new, student, and you add to that access to lab, access to doing experiments, and it'll just naturally happen. Take part A, part B, you're going to get papers coming out. And now that obviously, it's not as easy as that. Anybody who's written a paper knows it's not as simple as that. It was not that easy for me, even though I had a pretty easy start. What do I mean? I mean, in my group, they had just published this other paper right here where we basically had done the exact same thing. What we were looking at is if you've got a layered material, right? It stands to reason that the heat conduction in the layers will be different than perpendicular to the layers. And so that had already been shown in this previous paper where they looked at bismuth titanate, another layered material, right? An Arvillus phase. And they basically showed it. So all I had to do was say like, ooh, let's do that, but on this new phase, right? That's what my first paper was on. So I had a good template. I had access to lab. I had some knowledge, and yet it was brutal. The process looked something like this. I wish I could go back in time and I would pick up the actual paper copy of that one, covered in red ink, because it was drowning, dripping in red ink from my advisor making so many corrections. And I sat down with him, and over the course of hours, we read every sentence of that thing. And when I would say something incorrect, he would stop and he would correct me. And then we would fill in gaps in my understanding and explain context and explain all the things that I had done wrong in terms of writing, understanding. It was just a hard process. And that was just draft number one. There were future drafts that now moved to Word, where he would actually just do, smaller changes there that I would have to work through, and then I would have to retry it and send it to him. And what I'm getting at is that the magic that took me from a bad writer to a good writer, to where I'm at now 20 years later, was a human element, was my PhD advisor, and the inspiration for a killer mustache, if I do say so myself. Right? That human element is really, really magical. So is an AI capable of, doing that instead of the human, or supplementing that, or modifying that? I think it is. So let me show you why. When I think of the things that go into a technical document, technical writing, here's some things that come to mind. Now, I didn't come up with these. ChatGPT did. I asked it. I said, hey, when it comes to technical writing, what are the key components? And it did a great job. It said audience analysis, purpose and objective, structure and organization, precise language, visual aids, technical accuracy, good examples, thorough instructions, procedures, the formatting, the revisions and editing, citations, the document format, and feedback and iterations, right? All these things. So the question is, can generative AI help us with these 13 identified things? Let's kind of go through them. Well, let's start with finding your audience. It does a great job. Here's my prompt. I said, I'm a grad student working on anisotropy of thermal conductivity in these lanthanum dope strontium niobate. Help me brainstorm who my audience might be. Take a look at this. It might be your academic peers and researchers. That's who I was thinking of when I was doing this research, because that's the papers I've been reading. But also, what about people in industry? Well, yeah, they might also care about a paper like this. Or educators, high school educators might care. Or policymakers and funding agencies. How about the materials manufacturing world, or scientific publications in journals, collaborating institutes, the general public and science communicators? It did a good job of expanding my vision of who my audience could potentially be. And that's critical, because you can't start writing any technical document, you can't do any technical writing until you know who you're writing to, because their needs, what they want to get out of the document, depends on who they are and their situation. So this was really valuable. To already shows the value of generative AI to expand the breadth of considerations of who might be interacting with your document. Now, next off, what do they want out of it? This is really cool. I said, okay, how would the objective of the paper change for general public versus, say, a policymaker? But you could plug in whatever you want here. Look how good this is. For the general public, it's like, okay, for general public, we're going to prioritize simple language, focusing on the implications, use of visuals, contextualization, engagement, right? That makes sense. Your lay public doesn't have that background, so they need context to understand it in terms of things they have seen. They need simple explanations of difficult concepts. They need to keep the curiosity and interest there on a difficult subject matter. Very, very different, right? Now compare that to a policymaker. They really care about the policy relevance. If you're sending this to, say, the DOE, it's got to be energy related. It doesn't matter if you're talking about something if it's not related to their domain, right? Quantitative and qualitative impact, and emphasis on the impact. Like, what will this technology actually do? Could it have the potential to have cost savings or energy conservation or some other advances, right? That you should actually include policy recommendations, right? If you're sending this to a policymaker and you want to see subject X funded more, then you should have that as a recommendation. Or if it's no longer necessary to fund that because whatever reason, right? You can do that too. Economic considerations, how expensive will this be? The risk and uncertainty, like how, very interesting. And then I like this last one, brief and focus. These policymakers are busy, so you got to get right to the point. Very different, right? For every one of these different categories that we identify, all 8 of these, you could come up with a different objective and purpose of your document for probably all 8 of those. So it's done a good job so far of helping us broaden our idea of the potential audience. And then for each specific audience, we can come up with a very tailored objective and have key things that we know we need to include. So what do we include? If you ask it, say I said here, okay, let's assume I'm writing for a science publication and I want other academics and grad students as my audience. How should I structure the paper? Keep in mind, I wanted to submit this to the Journal of the American Ceramic Society. So it spits out this list of really pretty generic paper components, right? Title and abstract, intro, lit review, methods, results, analysis, conclusion, acknowledgement, reference, appendices. Like, pretty straightforward. Now, I think if I would have asked it, how would the structure look different if this was a technical memo to my boss, or if this was for a patent submission? It would identify some different structural components. So I think I picked maybe two normal one that most of us are familiar with, but I think it would do an okay job of actually structuring data pretty well for the different application. Now, you'll notice that one thing it's missing here that is a big passion of mine is data availability. Most journals, well, an increasing number of journals are requiring that we have a data availability section, which better not say upon reasonable request, because that's scummy. And if I've ever done that in the past, I've repented of my ways. Right? We don't do that anymore. So anyways, I asked it, I said, hey, does this require a data availability section? And you'll notice, check what it says. It's like, well, as of 2021, it says, whatever, the more and more we're starting to adopt it, but you should check this specific journal. So I like this type of response. As we know with generative AI, one of the big weaknesses is that they can hallucinate, right? That's just a reality. They're not perfect. And so I like that it's been fine-tuned to increasingly, when it has instances like this where it's not going to know for sure, to say you should check, right? I think that's the right answer there. There are some other weaknesses, by the way, with generative AI, which I forgot to mention in coding. One of the weaknesses is that the token size limitation, right? If you're writing a really big, long code, well, you only have X number of tokens. I don't know what the current one is at OpenAI, 4,000 or so. So what do you do if you want something longer than that? Because that includes both your input context you're providing and the output that it's spitting out. So many times when I've been toying with it, it will produce code and then just stop because it ran out of tokens. Now, sometimes you can just say, keep going, pick up where you left off, and it'll actually do a pretty good job. But sometimes it doesn't. So getting around that is a challenge. And there's ways to go about it, especially with coding. I think something useful is it actually kind of forces you to think more modularly. Instead of writing one big script that does what you want it to do, you can break that down into functions and modules that can then be swapped out into other, like building that neural network, right? It doesn't have to be like one giant flow where you do the whole training your model. Like building the network can be the module, right? So that's actually, there's ways to get around the token limitation, but it is a limitation in some instances. Okay, what else? Check this out. Generative AI does a pretty good job of identifying what might be useful visual aids. So for this one, it had the title of the paper, and then I also gave it the abstract and the conclusion, okay? So it knew what we did, right? Then I said, that said, what would be some useful visual aids or figures to go along with this paper? And check it out. It suggested the following. I should have a crystal structure illustration, clear one to show the different blocks, because a big part of our hypothesis in this work was that the blocks in these different layers of the structure were responsible for the low thermal conductivity. Basically, they had different densities. It says we need two plots as a function of temperature, thermal diffusivity, thermal conductivity. It says we need some sort of anisotropy illustration to illustrate that there's different, that you'd expect different heat in the plane versus out of plane. It said, you should have a phase transition graph, because we talked about how the thermal conductivity changed, or in this case, didn't change really across the thermal conductivity, across the phase transformation boundary. A schematic of possible phonon scattering mechanisms and microscopic structure illustration. So that said, compare that to what we actually have in our paper. Check this out. These are the figures that we had in there. We had a crystal structure. We had something that illustrated anisotropy. In this case, we used X-ray diffraction. Here you see the powder diffraction for random orientation versus textured. We'd oriented it, right? We have one showing the heat capacity and the phase transformation. We have also the phase transformation indicated on both of these, thermal conductivity and diffusivity versus temperature. In other words, we have the same stuff in this paper as it suggested, and it suggested a few other additional things, like that block where you show that the different blocks in the structure, like this perovskite slab versus the other, the density mismatch might be doing something to scatter phonons. It's a really good idea. Now, it does a good job of brainstorming the types of figures that should be present, or rather what should be in them, but actually making the figures is not always a strength of generative AI. Like here you see one where we actually tried to use matplotlib, and all I said was like, produce the text for an SVG demonstrating two photon scattering. And it said, I can't make SVGs. Well, it can. If you tell it to, it can. And later I'll show you it can. So instead I said, okay, just try making it in matplotlib. And this was the best it could. It's kind of interesting. It's not a good figure, but it has some good components to it. They're showing that the phonons are entering the blocks and they're going to scatter differently based off the blocks. It's really cool that just from the abstract and the conclusion, it's able to pull that out. I would not use this figure, but it's not a bad starting point for sort of ideating what might be a good figure, which comes to our third part, ideation. And you could try other tools, of course, right? So this is just one. The typical figure that you're looking for with phonon scattering might look something like this. This is not generated by AI. This is somebody made this in a schematic, something like Illustrator. And when I try and get it to, when I really try and like describe what I'm looking for in something like DALL-E 2 as a non-starter, in Matplotlib it's ish, in the SVG it's not great. Now I know there's many other AI tools out there, even some for making schematics. I've seen them make really good flowcharts with like mermaid scripts that it can generate. So maybe there's more to it. I haven't tried them all for sure. Like there's something called, I think it's called Graph GPT and a few others. Maybe they're really good and I need to explore them some more. But for now, I would say that generative AI does a good job of helping you identify which figures you need. And if you have the data to plot them, then you can do a great job in something like Matplotlib. But otherwise, if it's a schematic, like an illustration, you might not have the tools there yet. Would love to be proved wrong. If you know something, drop it in the chat. Share with everybody else. Okay, so what else can it do? It does a good job of identifying good examples to talk about in your paper. So here on the left, you've got abstract examples. On the right, you've got a summary of all examples. And it's got some good ones. Like if you have a material that conducts heat very differently in plane versus out of plane, what would that mean for electronic devices, right? That's a good one to talk about, right? Thermal management would be another good one. It talks about energy efficiency. So it does a good job of finding examples. Remember, because it's a dialogue bot, you can follow up on any one of these and say, okay, what would it actually mean for electronic devices if this was the case? And it can really, dive into it. So I like this for generating good examples for your reader to interact with, especially because you can remind it, considering that this audience for this paper is for high school students, help me come up with some good examples that are relevant to them. It'll do a great job. Okay. What about this one? This one's kind of interesting. We can use it to make sure that our procedures and our instructions are more thorough and complete. So here I took the experimental methods in the paper that I wrote. That's just as it was. I took that and I passed it into ChatGPT, and then I asked, are any steps missing or poorly explained? And it does a pretty good job of telling me where additional insight would be useful. Now, maybe that doesn't belong in a methods section. You're going to talk about that in the results, like why you did it a certain way. But maybe it does belong here. But it's done a good job of finding them, like, hey, you haven't talked about why you used whatever, these precursor powders or, this type of base in the solution, and maybe you ought to. So I like that. Now, you can also, here I took an example where I gave it a experimental methods and I said, what's missing? But you could go the other way around. You could say, to make something, how would you make it? Give me an experimental methods. I've seen people toy with this. I think it's really early days for it to demonstrate real utility, but it's interesting. Like here's one, the flavor of the week is LK99, which obviously just came out last month. And, I asked it because some people were griping about the original paper that didn't show all the details of synthesis that it could have. So out of curiosity, I was like, okay, how would you write an experimental methods for the synthesis of this chemical formula, the LK99 one? And here's what it came up with. A different approach than what's out there for the most part. It's using a co-precipitation route. It even has like a source of phosphorus. It's got, it's not a terrible, at a first glance, I'm not like really dug into this, but I would consider trying an approach like this. It's actually pretty clever. So certainly a lot could be coming down the road for, again, this goes back to ideation. This is actually moving into new directions. Like, could we use it as a tool to help us come up with new ways to make materials? Maybe. When it comes to lit review and finding articles, definitely it's the case that not all generative AI is equally capable. Some is better than others. Like on the left, here's ChatGPT where I said, for my paper on strontium niobate, help me find relevant references from literature. And it pulls up like a bunch of papers and none of them exist. Those are all fake. But there's other tools that are really good, like this one on the right from perplexity.ai. If you have not been using Perplexity AI, bookmark it right now. I use it all the time now. It's great. It's another large language model. It's another dialogue bot where you can ask questions and then keep on asking questions back and forth. But what's great is that this will find actual real articles that you can click on, like these things right here. I can click on them. Plus, when it summarizes the results, it ties the summary findings to a specific article that it's pulled from those papers. So it's much less likely to hallucinate because it's pulling content directly from those. So this is cool. If you followed, Andrew White and some of their work on like ChemCro and things like that, this is kind of like that. This is fine-tuning a model in light of new data in real time so that it can point to it. Very, very powerful application of large language models. Let's show you an example of this one. So we go to perplexity.ai and you can just ask a question. Let's try one out. Give me an example of anisotropic thermal conductivity for electronic devices, period. Focus on academic journal articles in the last 5 years. Okay, turn it loose. Let's see what it finds. Check it out. So it finds 6 different articles for us. We can click on any of these things and it's actually going to be something that's a real article you could dig into. And it looks like a match, right? Anisotropic thermal conductivity of composites, blah, blah, blah. Here's another one. High thermal conductivity in water scale cubic silicon carbide crystals, right? They summarize it right down here below. And you obviously can follow up on any of these things. Like, here it has some related questions that it automatically prompts. But you could ask a follow-up question like, would one expect anisotropy in cubic silicon carbide? I don't know if it's cubic or not. Let's see what it says. Actually, it might be hexagonal, actually. So blah, 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 and it has this really cool ability to sort of follow up. Why do I think this is great? Because a new graduate student, what I typically do with a new grad student is they come to the group, I assign them like 4 or 5 research articles and I say, read these. You're not going to understand everything. Just circle everything that you don't understand. Come talk to me and together we'll look at it and then I will explain everything that doesn't make sense. Here, they can basically do that. And this acts as a pretty good tutor for you to explain things or at least to get you started. And then I've obviously done my previous video right here in the chat below, at least on size space, where it does an even more thorough job. I'll show you an example of that right here. I've already mentioned size space before in another video. Again, check it out below if you want the full thing, but the ability to upload your PDF and then highlight a section and have it explain, say, like an equation, that's amazing. It took this complicated Hubbard model and broke it up into all its individual little parts, explained what those parts are doing in the equation. That's so rad. Or a single bit of text, if it's a single word like the Hikes formula or a big couple paragraph or sentences, you can ask it to explain things and it does a really good job. Or just ask specific questions like, what is a T2G orbital? And you can see it does a great job. Or summarize this whole paper in a couple 2-minute summary for me in outline format, and bam, bam, bam. Really, really cool tools that I think just change the way that not even undergrads, grad students are going to interact with the literature because you don't have to be there explaining everything to them. Now, it can get some things wrong, obviously. So this is like a first pass. It's a great way to get started because a lot of those early questions I didn't need to be there to explain for. This does plenty of a good job, and then they can come to me with the stuff that's still unclear or harder or more specific where these LLMs are not going to do as good. So pretty amazing. Yet another example. Okay, so summarizing technical writing. Here's all the different things that we started out with, and I'm going to put the ones that generative AI can really help with in green, the things that it can't help as much with in red. It's really good. And red maybe even should be, visual aids maybe should be green because it did a good job of identifying which ones might be useful. It just didn't generate them as well. Formatting and design and, the final document format, stuff like that. I don't know if generative AI is really the best tool. Like, I think human element is still really important there, but boy, the majority of this stuff, we can expand our capability quite a bit. I didn't need my PhD advisor to be there for all of these steps had I had those tools available, which it lets us do more with more. That said, at the beginning of this video, we started talking about generative AI and how it's changing the game for higher ed. And it is. I won't deny that it is, right? What does it mean, for example, with regard to ethics and plagiarism and student assessment? How are we going to know if students actually learn something if they can just whip up a college, essay that looks like the real deal? What does that mean? Well, that kind of brings me to my... Oh, and by the way, not just in academia, in research, check this out. I saw this on Twitter the other day. This came from an actual research article. And if you look close, they clearly just copy and pasted from a large language model because it's saying as an AI language model, I can basically, they didn't even read it. So do we really want research articles to be just copy and pasted from ChatGPT or wherever else into the article? No. These have to be vetted. It's fine to use it during ideation, during revision, during lots of steps, but we have to teach our students the right way to do it. So how are we going to do that? Let's dive into that by addressing at the same time this concept of how we can use these tools for ideation and brainstorming. So here's one. Here I'm going to say the following. My prompt is this. I'm a professor of materials engineering. I'm going to be having students do a lab on electrochemistry. They're going to deposit Prussian blue onto a glass slide. And then they're going to cycle that in a UV vis to correlate absorption with voltage. I'm worried about students cheating on their lab report. What suggestions do you have? Here it comes up with 11 really good suggestions for ways that you can try and deal with the reality is that students have access to generative models. They're going to use them. So one, you can say, just be clear with your expectations. You can tell them, hey, this is about hands-on, it's about learning. You're not going to learn if you're using ChatGPT. You could try and just do that. Another would be having unique experimental conditions. Try and make it so specific that a model couldn't catch it, basically. Right? There's no pre-written solutions online that will match your specific experiment. Okay. Randomize your procedures. That's a good one. So that's not the same each time. Incorporate conceptual questions. Actually, generative models do a pretty good job on conceptual questions, but still. Real-time data analysis, one-on-one discussions, unfamiliar sample materials, leverage lab reports, promote ethical conduct, surprise quizzes, like lots of good ideas. But one thing that I'm thinking a lot about going forward into this new semester is we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle, and I'm not interested in getting in the arms war of students using ChatGPT and faculty using GPT detectors, and then they get better and we get better. Like I don't want to play that game. And more importantly, when I talk to people in industry and I tell them about generative AI and what that means for higher ed, they're like, good, they should learn it. I mean, we use it all the time, right? They want us to train students that have the skill set. So it makes sense for us to provide opportunities to learn to use it, but to learn to use it the right way. So you're not having, misinformation propagated with hallucinations or biases or any other problems that can exist with these language models. We need to teach them how to use them the right way so those don't exist. So here's one way that I came up with. I said, okay, what about changing the assessment so that instead of evaluating the final document, say a lab report, I evaluate the process by which they create the final document. Could you help me draft instructions that include an expectation that they will use ChatGPT and sections where where they have to show me the prompt, how it was fact-checked, how they added real references, and how they made sure that there was no plagiarism, etc. And it generated a pretty good lab assignment where, it says what we're going to do, talks about the process guidelines, how they're going to use ChatGPT, how I want to see the prompts, I want to see the fact-checking, I want to see real references, I want to see checking for plagiarism, right? I think those and maybe others that you can think of are the steps that need to be present when you're using these generative AIs. But I think expecting them not to use it is as silly as thinking my students are not going to use a calculator. They're engineers. Like I want them to do bigger, better things than be just solving difficult analytical, integrals and derivatives the old-fashioned way on paper when they have better resources, right? If you've ever used a spell checker or if you use Grammarly, this is a sort of leveled up version of that. So I want them to learn to use it, but to use it the correct way. And as an example of that, this entire demonstration, this class I'm giving now on, don't fear the reaper with higher ed, this came out of me asking it for some prompts. I said, hey, I'm teaching a workshop for the Center for Teaching Excellence at an annual teaching symposium. It's going to be on generative AI. I want to cover examples on coding, technical writing, and ideation. Can you help me come up with an outline and some concepts? And check it out, it did a great job. And some of it I've actually followed along pretty close to when I was putting this together, which I think is really useful. But there's lots of other examples. For example, I'm really proud of my class that I teach on Weibull statistics. I think it's one of my better ones in my Intro to Material Science class. So I just said, hey, help me outline a 1-hour course that would cover Weibel's prompt modulus and probabilistic statistics. It does a great job. This is really, really good. It's even got the time breakdown that really makes sense. So, really, really good. So I think there's real opportunity to use with ideation. And now I'm a teacher, so I'm thinking about teaching, but this could be, if you're a student, it could be help me come up with a really good cover letter. Here's some things about me that I'm proud of. Fill it out really, really great. Or hey, I want to draft an email to my boss to get a raise. Here's some things I think I'm doing really well. And here's some career goals that I have in mind. It's so powerful. It's a tool that we should be leaning into and teaching students to use, but to use the right way and understand the limitations and understand where it can go wrong and learning how to get around those things, is my view. Okay, I'll just wrap up with this. Is it AI or IA? The difference here is what? Is it artificial intelligence, right? The Terminator robot, that just cold, hard machine that's going to do what it's going to do the best way possible? Or is it IA, which is intellect that's been augmented? I think intellect that's been... the example I love to always give is this one of Centaur chess. So Bryce Mehradig of Citrine Informatics was the first one that told me about this. But the idea is like early days, humans played chess and the grandmasters played each other, and it was amazing. And then along came Deep Blue or whatever it was, Gary Kasparov, right? When the human got beat by the computer, and it was like, oh my gosh. But after that, watching supercomputers play each other is not very exciting. It's just not something that... far fewer people are interested in that than watching humans play. But there's a middle ground called Centaur chess, like half horse, half man, where you take these, experts, and they have access to supercomputers that's giving them suggested moves, but they still make the move. And these are actually outperforming either grandmasters or supercomputers, which is pretty cool. I feel like this is where we need to be training our students. I think when it comes to higher ed and generative models, we have the chance to have intellect that has been massively augmented. We can really expand the capabilities of our students in really powerful, meaningful ways. I think we should lean into it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm gonna have a lot more content coming out now that I'm back from my sabbatical, and thanks for paying attention. See you next time.